and gentlemen, dear colleagues. The next few minutes will be an attempt to give both you and the world another reason for why this United Nations Environment Assembly means more than just a conference. We already know that you are debating many topics. We already know that environment is important. We have often discussed the links between environment and development. This year, as part of the new approach to the United Nations Environment Assembly in the high-level segment, the Executive Director is tasked with providing you with a science policy statement, in some ways a state of the world's environment overview. What I will do in the next few minutes is to take you from the terrestrial, from the surface of the terrestrial part of planet Earth, into the atmosphere, into the issues of food, into the oceans, and into the heart of our economies, because the picture that confronts us at this moment in time, despite all the optimism and the progress and the steps that already all of you in your countries have taken, the balance sheet is serious. Sadly, it is actually, in some respects, more serious than ever. And this is always the difficult part of our message, because environment is about the future, it is about optimism, it is about opportunity. But the way we are currently collectively managing the planet's resources simply does not yet add up to what we have agreed at many summits. But there are also reasons to see that this is not inevitable. Let me first of all say that the activities of the 7.06 billion people on the planet today compared to the 3.85 billion only 40 years ago are having increasingly serious consequences, not just for the environment, but actually for human well-being. We are today appropriating between 30 to 40% of the entire planet's plant production, double the amount 100 years ago. By the year 2050, conversion of savannas, grasslands, and forests to cropland for food, fiber, and fuel will be 320 to 849 million hectares, depending on the choices we will make. Land degradation, desertification, sandstorms, dust storms, floods is affecting 23% of global soils and leading to the loss of 2 to 5 million hectares of cropland per year. This statistic may seem peripheral. It is one of the most frightening that we should focus our attention on. Because losing cropland at a moment in time when we actually have to increase production, at least using current production systems, by 50 to 70%, how on earth will we feed 8, 9, 10 billion people when we are having a net loss of arable cropland already today? But there are positive trends. This is always the story of the environment, slightly schizophrenic. But I also want to embed in this presentation of facts what is the different story of an environmental agenda as part of the Sustainable Development Agenda in the year 2014. It is not the narrow outlook on environment. It is, in fact, the key to asking and answering the question about how will people find employment, energy, food, water to sustain the kinds of demand patterns we know. In the latest report from UNEP's International Resources Panel, we see that 320 million hectares can be saved by 2050 through the reduction, for instance, of food loss and food waste. Many of you were part of our wonderful dinner last year made entirely from so-called food waste here in Kenya. We fed all of you, and we fed you very well, and what we wanted to draw the world's attention to, together with our colleagues in the Food and Agriculture Organization, who are at the forefront of understanding this extraordinary fact, is that more than 30% of everything we produce today is actually lost or wasted. But also by delinking the biofuel and food markets, by improvement of diets, by the control of biomaterials consumption, by better land management, and, very important, the restoration of land. One example in China is that 15 million hectares of low-yield farmland and 17 million more of barren lands are being afforested through the Grain for Green policy program with a total planned investment of $70 billion. This is the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, speaking to the question of also restoration of land and productive capacity. But let me move you from the terrestrial realm all the way into the atmosphere. Climate change, ever present in your world, in your international negotiations. The IPCC's latest reports on the physical aspects of climate change, on mitigation, adaptation, underline the enormous challenges we face. Our own work with the Emissions Gap Report and that of so many other organizations and scientists simply keep on confirming that, which the IPCC has once again pointed to, namely that global average land and ocean surface temperature have increased by nearly 1 degree over the past century. And in parts of Africa, Asia, North America and South America, and here it gets even more frightening, surface temperatures have risen by up to 2.5 degrees. We now have evidence that the oceans are becoming more acidic, with consequences that we are even unable to fully comprehend at this stage, but we know it will change life in the marine realm as nothing before in human memory. The 10 to 15% annual increase in hydrofluorocarbons is another area that I want to highlight to you. HFCs is something most of us don't even know what they are or where they might be used. Well, they're all around you. They are, except actually in this hall, because we have a natural air conditioning system. But in most other climate control systems around the world's buildings, it is one of the substances that is being used. It is 1,000 times more potent than an equivalent amount of carbon dioxide. We are on the verge of making HFCs once again part of a massively expanded use at a point in time when we have the opportunity to avoid that. It is one reason why UNEP has been publishing over a number of years assessments around the question of HFCs, and we have projected that just in the next 30 to 40 years, if HFCs are truly not stopped from being introduced and also in the replacement of HCFCs, we will actually have wiped out the entire carbon dioxide that we have saved with the Kyoto Protocol over the last decade, decade and a half, because the impact of the HFCs being introduced into our economies, and they are rapidly growing, will have tremendous impacts. We will need to phase down these, otherwise we will end up with billions of tons in waste banks of refrigeration, air conditioning units and other equipment. It is why the conversation also between the Montreal Protocol, the UNFCCC process, the link to the multilateral fund may hold in due course the key to actually avoiding something before we have to then spend much more to get hold of this problem again. Let me also put particular attention on small island developing states. We all practice the rhetoric that they are the front lines of the victims of climate change, least prepared, least able, least responsible. This year is the year of small island developing states in the United Nations, and with the summit ahead of us in Samoa. We just dedicated the World Environment Day in 2014 to the linkage, the nexus between climate change and the future of small island developing states. Many of them literally looking at a prospect of their very survival being threatened, the world with a great deal of empathy, but with very little practical solidarity manifesting itself in what we are able to do. The United Nations system will be called upon, as hopefully will all citizens again later this year, to think more carefully what it means to not be responsible, but actually be the victim of the actions of others. This is the ultimate conversation about global solidarity in addressing climate change and the link to the survival of peoples and communities on small island developing states. Sea level rise is nothing that you will be able to fight. There is no way you can build an infrastructure somewhere in Micronesia or ultimately in the Caribbean that will allow you to stay in your country when sea levels rise by 80, 90, 100 centimeters by the end of this century. This is almost like a death sentence for a nation. We still seem to think that this is something we do not need to worry about in a dramatic sense. Doing nothing is not an option. It will lead to higher costs in the context of climate change. It will lock in a carbon-intensive infrastructure, greater risks to economic disruption, exposure to extreme events, and loss of resilience. Where do we look for resilience? Well, in some respects, while we actually should be building the capacity of nature and enhancing it to provide us with greater resilience, much of the record that, as you know, has actually been depleting nature's capacity to enhance our resilience. But not always are we moving in the wrong direction. Indeed, protected areas is an aspect that many of you have been engaged with, and the story is not a bad one. Today, 40% of natural vegetation is legally protected on our planet. 100 years ago, it was virtually zero in the sense of a formal system. Let us always remind ourselves, whether it was for cultural, for religious, or other social traditions, conservation and protection did not start with a modern system of protected areas. But in the modern world, we know that many of these would not have been able to withstand the pressures if they had not been legislated and hopefully increasingly also financed and managed as protected areas. Over the last decade, the Brazilian protected area network, for instance, expanded by 60%. That great water lung of the whole South American continent, water pump rather, and global lung, has received a significant boost. But so have the expansion of protected areas of forest and afforestation across large nations and small. And this morning you heard the President. This must be one of the few constitutions in the world in which a 10% forest cover has now been enshrined in the new constitution. We see actions across the planet, also in the European, North American context, but particularly on the front lines of where deforestation in the tropical zones are happening. But 25% of terrestrial regions and 50% of marine areas have less than 5% protected. So our job is not done. And again, speaking to the CBD, to the Nagoya outcomes and to the targets associated with the COP, the world has committed itself to a significant increase here. It is also our responsibility in UNEA to continuously reinforce, remind ourselves, and also report on the progress. But let me move for a moment deeper into the marine realm, because much of our attention often is focused on the terrestrial. We are discovering more and more that we know so little about the marine realm, and let me also say that one of the reasons why I am putting emphasis on this topic here is that amongst us today is also former President of Costa Rica, who is also actually a member of the World Oceans Commission and who will present the World Oceans Commission's report in a press conference in a few hours' time. It's an effort to once again draw the world's attention to what is happening with the world's oceans. And Jose Maria Figueres has been a lifelong advocate in a nation that has been a pioneer in the environment, in the green economy agenda, and I'm very glad that he will bring to the attention of all of you today the latest findings. Our concern is growing rapidly because what we are finding in terms of marine debris and plastics, made up of everything from construction materials to plastics to hazardous waste, all from unsustainable consumption, production and poor waste management on land, is contaminating our food, our beaches and water. Even on the beautiful beaches of Mombasa, if you go after a lively night of winds, what you will find in terms of plastic just washed up on this beautiful shore is extraordinary. But on the positive side, there are people such as the 19-year-old Boyan Slat, a Dutch engineering student, one of those wonderful people who just symbolizes the power of one of getting up one day and saying, I'm going to do something to clean up the oceans. And he has come up with an ocean cleanup array, a solar and sea-powered system to channel plastic pieces into miles of interconnected booms from where they can be transported to shore and sold. Because let me also emphasize, all that plastic is not waste. It is actually a resource. And you saw earlier on here already in Kenya a wonderful example of plastic bags and plastic bottles being collected and through local enterprise being turned into fence poles, creating over 50 jobs and probably sustaining well over 250 people from something that otherwise would simply lie in the street or end up in a waste field. It is being done, it can be done, but very often it is the poor lone pioneers who need your support. But what I just described in terms of this marine debris, let me open the lens a little bit further, the aperture, and point to the fact that human health, human well-being, yes, we all know is related to a healthy environment, but do we actually know how dramatic that linkage is? Environmentally related death and disease points to the fact, and this is our colleagues in the WHO, that nearly 25% of all diseases and death are due to unhealthy living and working environments and environment-related causes. Up to 90% of wastewater in developing countries to this day flow untreated into rivers, lakes, coastal zones, threatening our health and ecosystems. This against the backdrop of 2.5 billion people still lacking access to improved sanitation facilities. But, and you have heard also the president of UNEA this morning alluding to it, the biggest, perhaps some of the most silent, but certainly the most dramatic real killer is air pollution. The decision before you, the resolution that you are negotiating in this high-level segment and will hopefully adopt tomorrow, may be one of the most powerful ways in which to save lives that we can join forces with many other entities in moving forward in combating air pollution. 3 billion people still rely on solid fuels and traditional biomass and coal for cooking and heating. They have no choice. Or they have, if only we would be able to deploy these technologies faster. 4.3 million people per year die prematurely, and half of the deaths in children under 5 years of age are due to household air pollution and inefficient use of solid fuels, alongside a further 3.7 million deaths coming from outdoor pollution due to transport, energy, production and industry. These sums together are 4 times larger than the combined death toll every year of all HIV victims and those who die of diarrhea, and those numbers in themselves are shockingly high. Where does all this happen? This is again the connection between environment where people live and practice, eat, consume, produce. It is in the cities, in the urban areas which are home to, we all know it, more than 50% of the world's population. You also heard earlier on 60 to 80% of energy consumption, 75% of carbon emissions, and 75% of the consumption of the world's natural resources. And herein lies a very important realization. Cities are not automatically and in themselves a more efficient pathway to addressing resource consumption. In fact, very often by moving into the cities, we increase waste, we increase inefficiency in resources. Yes, we have more convenience, we have lower costs in perhaps providing services, but with the overall footprint, do not assume that urbanization automatically delinks economic development from resource consumption and inefficiency and pollution. Since 2000, and this is another thing that we need to be aware of, that combined consumption and demand have also led us to the point where we are not anymore in the abstract talking about resource-constrained economies. Indeed, the International Resources Panel, in its recent report just released a few weeks ago, again pointed to the fact that metal prices have risen by 176% since 2000, the year 2000, rubber by 350%, energy by an average of 260%, and the peak metal age will certainly occur for some elements by the year 2050. And let me tell you again, there are the rich who can afford this, the rich in New York, the rich in New Delhi, the rich in Nairobi. But few realize that in many small island developing states, the cost per kilowatt hour of electricity is 400% that of an average US citizen. That is the economics of dependency on fossil fuels when you are a citizen in a small island developing state. Today there are, however, more and more specialty metals also in our phones, in our electronic equipment, and we often underestimate that in fact in the waste dumps, in the drawers of our homes, we have for some of these metals already larger reserves than are actually proven to exist in the ground. The new concept of urban mining is not just a dream of somebody who thinks that they can turn waste into money. It will become increasingly essential. But interesting enough, again, what is stopping us from doing this? There is gold, there is platinum, there is metals, there is rare earth in every cell phone, in every computer, and yet we dump these things in an avalanche of electronic waste. Because the design of the products is done in such a way that it is so expensive to extract these materials that it's cheaper to throw them away. We have worked with the International Resources Panel in trying to bring attention to the world's manufacturers that if you only change your design principles and build into that already the concept of recycling, you would suddenly open up a universe for recycling, not just with very heavy machinery and technology, but right here, very often in what is called the Juakali sectors, but with safer conditions and much greater opportunity for income. There's another example I want to quickly point to on what is happening in our technology markets, because it is part of the reason why you should leave UNEA here, not only burdened by the statistics I'm giving you now, but also by the enormous opportunities that are opening up. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard of Elon Musk, this extraordinary entrepreneur with his company Tesla and many other things that he does, including flying into space and putting solar panels on roofs. But he has done one thing just a few weeks ago that I think points to something quite extraordinary. Elon Musk announced that with his Tesla electric cars, in which he nearly went bankrupt 3 times and that now are taking off like there is no other competition, he announced that he will actually give away the designs of his Tesla electric cars, surrendering the intellectual property, because his view is this is the way that we will actually create a market for hybrid vehicles that will allow mass consumer access to this and actually will drive innovation across an industry and ultimately also benefit him. This is the antithesis of 150 years of an intellectual property regime that believes it is the only way in which we can get private sector investment to happen. Now, don't let me be misunderstood. It is neither our task nor my role to interpret the intellectual property rights regime, but as you know, this is an issue that constantly in the discussion on climate change is there. We need to work more with business, because in this one gesture lies perhaps the key to unlocking one of the major challenges we have in the technology transfer, technology support domain. And this is not to say that everybody should give away what they have spent and invested in, but sometimes in these transitions to a green economy, if you want to create markets, you want to scale them up fast, maybe this is a shortcut rather than actually a dead end. Energy, the technical potential to reduce energy demand through improved efficiency is in the order of 50 to 80%, and often it is argued that this is the privilege of the rich countries. Actually, I would argue that this is an imperative for poor countries. Whether you take the statistics on small island developing states, the fact that Africa has only put the infrastructure in place for 1/3 of its population to actually have access to electricity, which means the next 2/3 are going to happen in the next 30 years. It's not a legacy economy that is holding us back here, it is access to technology and finance, and what an extraordinary opportunity for countries to be able to leapfrog into an age where they're not dependent on fossil fuel markets, at least 100% in the global context, but can draw on their own resources that often may be absolutely without a finite curve. I pointed in my Monday speech to some of you who were here also to a phenomenon that inextricably links to all of these issues that we're going to try and address, and therefore the science of environmental change and the state of the world's planet cannot be divorced from the issues of equity, be it in terms of access, in terms of equality or fairness, as we heard also in our Unplugged Global Town Hall meeting. The number that made me sit up of 85 people today having as much wealth as the 3.5 billion of the world's poorest is simply unsustainable from many perspectives. But in the midst of all of this, with all of these phenomena that we are describing and all the science that is available to us, we must recognize that the diversity of our economies that are experiencing, yes, on the one hand, emerging wealth, tenacious growth, some of them still in recovery, some with uncertain prospects and others in shock therapy. If we cannot align economic policies across national boundaries, then addressing these fundamentals in terms of the science of environmental change and its impact on people and our natural capital, then we will not succeed, and many people will become poorer and a few will become even a lot richer. That is what is tearing on the fabric not only of societies nationally, but even within our United Nations family, let us be honest. And what we have spent a lot of time in the last few years with many scientists, experts and economists is to point to the importance of natural capital as part of this equation for the future. Heightened interest in carbon sequestration. Few thought of forests as carbon sinks. When you talk about carbon capture, we always talk about high-tech answers. What nature has been doing is storing, capturing carbon for millennia, and it's our biggest carbon storage. That's why concepts such as RED Plus are now thriving, and hopefully will begin to give the economic and ecological rationale the kind of momentum that we need to deal with the deforestation phenomena that we're observing across the globe. It is vital that countries include their natural assets in the systems of national accounts. And again, Rio +20 and the future we want pointed to this, and particularly through the system for environment and economic accounting that the UN is facilitating. 22 countries are in fact already doing so: Costa Rica, Kenya, Madagascar, Morocco, Guatemala, Indonesia, Rwanda, Colombia, Philippines, New Zealand, Canada, Netherlands, and UK. Sorry if I rush you through this list, but do you notice something very interesting? The majority in this list is actually developing countries. And again, I want to point out to you that very often when we talk about these things, the curve and the frontier of innovation has moved from the northwest increasingly to the southeast in an inclusive sense of the word. These issues are not ones on which we should be divided. They're actually issues on which we should be reinforcing one another's ability to move forward, because 60 more countries now already have also this approach to including natural assets in their systems of national accounts in the pipeline. This could eventually be the majority of the world's economy. You know that in UNEP we have put a lot of energy in helping countries and helping the environmental and economics community to come to grips with this in order to assess the stocks of natural capital. And a lot of this you can now find on our new platform, UNIP Life, which is UNEP's attempt to break out of the 20th century and into the 21st century of knowledge management through digital platforms. On there you will find on UNIP Live composite maps for both the terrestrial and marine realms, and providing a baseline from which to monitor change in the status of national ecosystem assets. Indeed, I very often draw on the example I find just in my immediate vicinity here in Kenya, when we helped the Kenyan government to undertake an estimation of its water towers that His Excellency the President referred to this morning, and found that their value to Kenyans and the economy runs in the millions of dollars. UNIP Live, Excellencies, is part of our exhibit here this week. Please do take a moment to have a look at it, but its main objective is to put at your fingertips, in your offices, the data and the statistics both about your country that sometimes are difficult and dispersed, but also of the whole world. And that one thing that we have been waiting and working towards, to get environmental data to the point where every nation can input its own data and we can speak as a global community with up-to-date data, will one day become reality. Already we have made significant progress. I want to thank many of your countries for having been part of this, because you could this morning walk out of this room and look at the live data from an hour or 15 minutes ago of the PM 2.5 in Berlin, in Beijing, or in New Delhi, because these UNEP Live networks are now linked to live data and monitoring. Our dream, and let me conclude my statement with this, is that as UNEP we provide to you the trusted and also supportive platform that will allow us to have the science, not only in bits and pieces, but increasingly allowing us to get a picture of the state of the planet and its relationship and its impact on our economies and societies in a much more comprehensive, strategic and usable format. By sharing our efforts and information through policies that promote open access, we will be able to build and shape what I would like to call a commonwealth of knowledge that can be used to support the Sustainable Development Goals that will be so central and that will depend so much on the ability of science and empirical work to underpin the targets, but also the ability of countries to monitor their progress, hold each other accountable, but more importantly, make us all better political, institutional, social leaders who can actually exercise the responsibility for the stewardship of the world's natural resources. I thank you for the ability to bring you in a very condensed form what is an enormous amount of data. My main message to you is the environmental changes that we are documenting are extremely serious. To the next generation already, they may prove to be absolute in some respects. What we have also tried to weave in here is that all over the planet there are actually response strategies being developed. The question is, can the United Nations Environment Assembly exercise what is truly its comparative advantage, which is to connect the world's nations, to unify efforts, to inform one another of what is possible, what has been done, and why we actually do not have to look at the future with a sense of doom and gloom. If UNEA lives up to this test over time, then it may be one of the great gifts to humanity and also demonstrate that environment is not something that divides us. Environment is something that unifies us across all borders, economies, ideologies, and communities. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Executive Director, for your briefing on the state of the environment and science policy interface.